So within the United States, there might be a particularly Arab American or Muslim xenophobia. There might be in border states Mexican American or Mexican xenophobia, and so on and so on, right? So that xenophobia results as one of the consequences of terrorist activities, right? And what ends up happening, and we saw this in post 9/11, unfortunately, post 9/11 attacks, is that radical American groups and individuals, more likely than not, attacked Muslim Americans because of this increase in xenophobia. Now, how does this attack on Muslim Americans affect and serve the advantages of the terrorist organization? Because innocent Muslims, in the example of Muslim Americans, are being attacked, fully being American citizens, fully having the rights that other Americans have, but because they've been identified as being other, right? Because they've been objectified, because of the increase in xenophobia, this actually plays into the fear and hysteria that the terrorist organization has, right? Because the more innocent people are attacked, the more those who are targeted for attack will have an affinity with the terrorist organization. So indirectly, it actually fuels the organization's overall intent, right? But there isn't, properly said, an ideology that is associated specifically with terrorism as such, other than the notion that terrorist organizations of any ilk, of any type, are interested in, obviously, increasing fear among the population. Number three, one of the other problems, the last problem in defining terrorism, is that understanding what terrorism is or why it occurs does not imply, right? It does not imply an ability to treat or curb the occurrence of terrorism, right? Because I understand what terrorism is, it doesn't mean that I'm going to be able to stop terrorism. The separation between the gulf between understanding and preventing is a huge gulf. And this is noted by Jeffrey Ross in a 1994 paper called The Psychological Causes of Oppressional Political Terrorism Toward an Integration of Findings, right? So Jeffrey Ross describes this gulf, right? So there is a sense of gulf, an expanse, a lacuna, whatever, right? There is this gulf between understanding and preventing, right? There's this huge gulf between understanding and preventing. Because you have an awareness, because you have an understanding, it is not the case that an understanding or an awareness is is a sufficient condition for preventing. So, to be technical, understanding is not a sufficient condition for prevention. Right? Because you understand what terrorism is, it does not mean because you've attained that understanding that you will necessarily stop terrorist activity. It is not a sufficient condition for prevention. However, it is a necessary condition, right? Understanding is, however, it is a necessary condition for prevention, right? Understanding is, however, a necessary condition for prevention, meaning that in instances where terrorist activities are prevented, obviously the reason why the activity, the attempted attack, the plot, whatever, was circumvented, was prevented because there was an understanding, not only of what terrorism is in the abstract, but obviously an understanding of the detailed plan so that there could be some intervention prior to the attack, right? You cannot have prevention without awareness, but awareness isn't enough. For me, as a genocide scholar, I started the Institute for Genocide Awareness and Applied Research, and the whole point of the NGO, which is represented by the best genocide scholars in the world, is to increase awareness, right? To increase understanding, right? Why? It's not the case that for IGAR, the Institute for Genocide Awareness, because we have an awareness of what genocide is, because we have graduate students from all over the world engaged in our program, because we have the best names in genocide scholarship engaged in our program, that all of a sudden there's no genocide. No, genocide's going to continue, right? However, without this understanding, you can rest assured, right? That there will never be any means of prevention, right? So you do need awareness. There has to be awareness in order for us to talk about prevention and intervention on genocide, terrorism, international warfare. But awareness and understanding in itself isn't enough, right? You need more than that, which is why I'm an activist, right? Which is why I'm a man on the street getting stuff done, because, you know, just publishing and writing books is not going to be enough. So my strength then is getting it done, right? Getting it done. Okay. So that concludes the 3 problems of defining terrorism. The next point in section 1.1 pertains to the 4 general forms of terrorism. So I'm going to take a little bit of time and talk about the 4 forms of terrorism, what they are, how they manifest, and how we can identify these 4 forms of terrorism in discussing international war. Okay, so these are 4 forms of terrorism. The first form of terrorism is known as domestic terrorism, right? D-O-M. Right, the first is known as domestic terrorism. And basically, the terrorist actions involve the citizens, or they happen within the territory of one's own country. Right, so the domestic terrorist, right, for domestic terrorism, if we have the borders of the state, domestic terrorism, which I'll abbreviate DT, happens within the state. Right? Domestic terrorism happens within the state, typically from citizens of the state. So the events of that Timothy McVeigh's actions within the United States of America constitutes a form of domestic terrorism. Right? Mailing anthrax to one of the congresspersons or individuals in Senate, a form of domestic terrorism. Right? The terrorist act took place within the domestic jurisdiction of the state, and more than likely, if not always, happens as a consequence of a citizen of the state. Right? It's not necessarily the case that it has to be a citizen, but it's usually a citizen of whatever the state is that is initiating the terrorist attack. So the first form of terrorism is domestic terrorism. The reason why it's important to recognize these 4 forms of terrorism is that awareness, increasing awareness with the hope of intervening and preventing, is going to be different for each of the 4 forms of terrorism, right? So that when we talk about terrorism as an umbrella, as a sort of a generalized concept, underneath that generalized concept are these four types, if you will. And each of these types have different approaches to intervention and prevention, right? So that's the overall idea. Second form is what's known as international terrorism, right? International terrorism. So the second is international terrorism. And this is a quote from Crenshaw. Terrorist actions, quote, involve the citizens or territory of more than one country, right? So that the terrorist actions involve the citizens or territory of more than one country. So you can imagine that I have state 1 and I have state 2, right? I have state 1 and state 2. This is just a sort of general example. And my target is state 3. Right? So I have state 1 and state 2. My target is state 3. Terrorist sympathizers right, come from, right, terrorist sympathizers come from both state 1 and state 2, right? So that I have individuals from state 1 and I have individuals from state 2, typically organized in what are known as cells, right, which are clusters of cells, which are clusters of organized terrorist sympathizers, right? So when you hear the term cell, cells refer to technically clusters of organized terrorist sympathizers. I might have cells in state 1 and state 2, and I use those cells to attack, right? I use those cells to attack members in State 3. This is obviously very, very advanced form of international terrorism, and usually what ends up happening is that there's heavy recruitment in State 1 and State 2 by terrorist organizers to elicit sympathy for the terrorist faction in multiple states, and then information is communicated, obviously encrypted and coded, to sympathetic terrorist cell members to attack some other state at a particular time, right? Obviously, this is what happened in the September 11th attacks, right? Multiple individuals were involved throughout many different countries throughout the world, all of which were organized with a specific target, with a specific date, and that attack was obviously an international act of terrorism. Hence, we can see the relationship between international war on the one hand and terrorism on the other, which is why I'm presenting the information as international war and terrorism.